You are listening to Latinx America, a podcast focused on highlighting catalysts who are using, leveraging, or creating technology to help our community achieve more. With your host, Adriana Flores Ragade. Francis, thank you so much for joining us at Latinx America. Why don't we start by learning about your personal journey into tech?
Sure. So my personal journey started back in high school. I was actually originally interested in biology. I had a very inspirational high school teacher. I think her name was Deborah, but I don't remember off the top of my head. But either way, she was an inspiration to me all throughout middle school and high school, and same school. And so I was going to pursue biology, but then I realized towards the end of high school that if I did decide to pursue biology, I would probably be going down the med school route. A lot of bio majors tend to go down that route. And I was not interested in medical school. I am a very impatient person. I couldn't see myself dedicating years upon years, in one thing. It's just not my style. So I looked into the only other thing that I was really interested in at the time, which was computers. My dad gave me a lot of computer games when I was younger, and they were all just to teach me STEM. He himself is a math professor at a college from where I'm originally from, Virginia, and he would give me these computer games to teach me math, science, mostly math. He's really into math, and I really enjoyed them, and it was kind of my fun thing to do outside of regular school back in the day. So I again explored this idea of computer science, and I didn't have any family members who knew anything about computer science, and I think that's a story a lot of women of color can relate to, that a lot of their relatives don't know anything, a lot of their family members can't speak to it, so you kind of have to learn everything on your own, and that's what I did. So I took a lot of online courses, free online courses, that taught me the basics of coding and Python, HTML, CSS, JS, the basic building blocks of the web. I got really interested in that, and I did that passively for about a year, and this was during my senior year of high school. Outside of classes, I decided, hey, you know what, this is a lot of fun. I really enjoy it. I think I'm going to go for it. And so I applied to be a CS major for my bachelor's degree. So that's kind of how I got started. And I've been a developer professionally since 2015, and I also have a bachelor's and master's in computer science now.
So you went to graduate school after working for a while. Were you working and going to school at the same time?
No, actually, I heard from a lot of people who had done a master's after working for some time that it took sort of more resilience, I think, to want to go back and get that master's, because the pay is so good in the tech industry as an engineer that there's little motivation to go back and do a master's. So considering those opinions that I heard from a few people, I decided to go ahead and just get my master's over with right after my bachelor's degree.
You are also currently working at Slack, right? Can you tell us about your experience at this company?
Yeah, sure. So for background on the role I'm doing now, I'm currently a software engineer specializing in UI development on the customer acquisition team at Slack. So what that essentially means is that we are top of the marketing funnel. This means we're trying to get someone who's never heard of Slack before, which is of course still the majority of the world, interested in using Slack, for the first time or trying it out. And so we do that through our Slack.com experiences, and I'm the one who helps implement those. And I work with a lot of different people, designers, marketing, SEO, sales. I think we're one of the more cross-collaborative teams, engineering teams out there.
So you're a female engineer, which everyone says is really hard to find, but we know we have talent out there. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the involvement that you have as a Latina leader, as a Latinx leader in the tech world?
Yeah, so just to add on to what you said, I know that there are a lot of people that say, oh, I can't find female engineers, or I can't find women of color engineers. And I think it's a lie. But at the same time, I recognize there is a very leaky tech pipeline. We're not given the same opportunities as other sort of groups. But I think we also have a lot of power in just our numbers. We're the second largest ethnic minority in the United States, and I don't think any of us should take that for granted. So in terms of just that being a female engineer, a woman of color, that intersectionality has been hard to deal with at times because within the tech industry, there does seem to be more support for women in tech, like supporting them, elevating them, making sure they're thriving, and not just having an entry-level role. But I think the conversation tends to leave out women of color when we're talking about women in tech. And I've seen this a lot, going to events that cater to women in tech or conferences or podcasts or newsletters, etc. It seems to, not always, but most of the time, it doesn't seem to include women of color into that conversation. So I'd like to see that change some more. So what I've been doing is looking for other types of affinity groups that I can relate to. And one of the big ones has been Tequila, which is this nonprofit that represents one of the largest communities for Latinx in tech. And it's something that I've been personally involved with for the past year and a half.
And for people listening to Tequila or listening about Tequila, can you describe what it does, how someone can join, and how it has helped you move forward in your career?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's really just a community of Latinx in tech to support one another, provide resources, provide a network, connections. We have, our primary form of communication is through our Slack community, but we also have a LinkedIn group, Facebook page, Facebook group, GitHub organization, all the things really that you can think of. We have some presence there, but I think mainly the use case for me in my time there has been, first of all, to give some context, I was looking for a new job over a year ago, and I wanted to learn about the experiences of people who are working at Slack. So the first place I looked, one of the first places I looked was Tequila. So I asked in one of the jobs channels, does anyone have any experience working at Slack, or are you a current employee? And I was able to have genuine conversations with about 3 different current engineers at Slack through that, initiative that I made in the Tequila Slack community. And it was only through that, I think, that I came in a lot more prepared than I could have been for the interview process. So for me, it helped me find my next job, my current job where I am now. And then I think the other major use case is just the networking part. It's easy to feel isolated as a Latinx in your workplace, especially if there's no one else who looks like you. So having that community, like we have local events like comida meetups, películas meetups, we're trying to have those. And it's just like coming together and just reminding yourself, hey, you're not alone. There are people working on similar problems that you're working on and who, you can relate to in terms of background, and you're not alone, basically. So I think that's the other big use case. In terms of what we're trying to do, though, like strategically, we are trying to have more formalized partnerships with these like larger, more notable companies like Lyft. So we have an exciting event like lined up for May, I believe, end of May. And that's an example of a more formal thing that we do. And we're also planning on creating a member portal, which will just have a directory and sort of more resources to like elevate your career, because we recently got a $10,000 grant from Century to work on this open source like member portal. So that's just one aspect that we're also working on as well, and that's all open source related.
So that's people contributing from different parts of the world.
Exactly.
And you're grabbing this code and you're putting something together to help Latinx or people of color stay connected. Can you tell me about your experience as a woman of color in this industry?
Yeah, so I often, like, when I get asked that question, I often think of the opposite, like, what would it be like if I were, in fact, I don't know, the dominant person in the room? Is like, what would my experience be like, or how would it be different if I were a white male, like in the tech industry, right? Like a white heterosexual male. And so to sort of piggyback off that contrast, I think I've had trouble being confident, and I've heard this from a lot of other women of color in tech, like just having confidence in my skill set, knowing that I'm enough, that I bring value to the table, has been something I've struggled with. There's a phrase for it, imposter syndrome. I think many people go through it, but especially, women of color, if they don't have that support network, if they don't understand there are other people out there suffering like they are, through this like feeling of not being enough, it's going to be really hard. And I think that if you're not a minority or if you're not a woman, you don't have to deal with that as often. I mean, you probably will, but not as strongly, So I always ask myself the opposite question. And so one thing is confidence. I've struggled with that. And the second thing, as a woman of color in tech, I've also struggled with is sort of credibility. And I think this plays into confidence. So I will be honest, one of the reasons I did decide to get a master's and even a bachelor's, in computer science, even though I personally feel like neither of them are really a requirement for being successful as an engineer, is that it adds credibility, to me as an engineer. And as a woman of color, credibility is extremely important. And the more credibility you have, the easier things are probably going to be for you when someone is comparing you, to the male next to you, or when you're in a room and people are comparing you again because you're the only woman of color in the room, right? So I think to me, those two things have been the two things that I've struggled with trying to maintain or improve. But overall, I mean, I've been seeking those support networks, those affinity groups that I can relate to and, grow from. And that has been really positive for me. So it's not all negative.
So you took kind of like what I would call a straight road into the traditional road into tech. So you went to college, CS, had a lot of wonderful experiences with coding before even getting to college, right? And then you got a master's. And what would you say to someone listening that might not be set on this, traditional path? Are there other ways in which one can join the tech world?
Oh, yes. There are many ways, and I'm fully supportive of all of them. So when I was doing my undergrad in CS, I learned about coding boot camps, and this is probably something you're familiar with already, but essentially they're these, on average, 4-month programs that are very intensive, and at the end of that program, you're supposed to be able to get a junior developer job. So essentially within those 4 months of being in the program and then the other 4 months of maybe doing the job search max, less than a year, you're supposed to have a junior developer job, right? Instead of doing a 4-year CS degree program. So that's actually something I decided to do myself during the summer when I was in undergrad. And so I was able to not have to drop out of college because that was a big no-no for my parents. Both my parents, immigrated here from Peru in their early 20s and always instilled into me that education was the only way I was going to make it in this country. And, they both have PhDs or pursuing PhDs. So just, growing up in that household, education was everything. And anyway, I wasn't going to drop out, obviously, but I did end up doing that coding boot camp. It was called Full Stack Academy. So that's one way you can break into the tech industry without having to spend 4 years or, a large sum of money for the undergrad. And then another way you can break in is if you already have a little bit of experience, like at least 6 months, you could also do an apprenticeship program. And these apprenticeship programs, I think, are becoming a lot more popular. These are essentially, unlike internships that really target college students or brand new college students, these are for anyone from any background, regardless of age, or if they have a degree in CS or not. But you're still getting paid to learn, essentially. And these are about, on average, 6 months long. Yeah, so those are the two things that I would recommend.
Thank you, Frances. So you talked about the leaky pipeline, and I know that Capor Center has done a lot of research on it. Are there some strategies that you have seen worked, especially when it comes to diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, I think one of the little aspects that they noted on their website was that during the workforce, a lot of minorities and women tend to just stay in the entry-level positions, and they're not getting promoted as fast, or it's harder for them to self-advocate for themselves. And this is something that I used to struggle with, but I think I've gotten a lot better at it. So for example, just being on this podcast, right, and putting myself out there, and a lot of people would, doubt themselves or question whether they have enough value to add to this podcast and, share their insight and their opinion on things. But that is kind of the practice of self-advocacy, advocating for yourself because you do feel like you bring enough value to the table. And one of the ways I've been able to combat that has been through these affinity groups that I've joined. So it's not just Techaria, it's also other women in tech groups that I feel are inclusive. It's also within Slack, joining the ERG or the Employee Resource Group for people of color, for women, and being active there and feeling included. So all of those things are kind of forms of self-advocacy, like putting yourself out there, being able to connect with others that you can relate to, and just growing from there. And that's something that they pointed out as something that needs work, because a lot of the time we find ourselves in these positions where we are isolated because there's so few of us in the tech industry, and we don't seek out, others, if that makes sense. So I think that's something they pointed out on their website.
Yeah, and that makes sense too in terms of what you're living and what you mentioned earlier about overcoming imposter syndrome. A big part of it is, becoming an advocate for yourself. Let me ask you, you mentioned that you are also a member of a couple of other women in tech organizations. Can you just give us some names of great orgs that you either belong to or have come across that would be helpful for our listeners?
Oh, yeah, for sure. So one of them is Women Tech Makers, and this is under the Google umbrella. So this is Google's way of sort of promoting women in tech, and they have a lot of great events, and also a Slack community. So that's one, Women Tech Makers. Another one is Women Who Code, and I would argue that's probably one of the largest organizations for women in tech. They're very active, so that's a good one. Right Speak Code is another one that has a lot of events across the US, and they're for women and non-binary individuals in tech as well. And then Latinas in Tech is a great one as well. And these all have Slack communities. And they're very open to having people join in on their events or just join in on any of their social media platforms. So I highly recommend all of these. I will advise against one because I've heard bad things in terms of how they treat minority women. Apparently, Girl Develop It has not been inclusive for the most part when it comes to minority women. I haven't experienced that personally with Girl Develop It, but I've heard a lot of stories from people, so that's just something I would also flag.
Thank you. That's always helpful too. Are there people that you follow too, in addition to belonging to different organizations, that you follow that you think you learn from and that others can do as well?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So I think, well, I'm a little biased here, but these are all people I've interacted with at some point or another. But Josh Torres, he works at the Keyport Center. Every interaction I have with him is just so, positive and reinforcing. I've never had a negative interaction with him. And he's very active within the Latinx and tech community, and also just VC in general, or venture capital. So Josh Torres is one. Mina Markham is a coworker of mine, but she's also very well known within the Black community in tech, like Black Tech's Twitter, and also within system designs, which is something relevant to me. So Mina Markham is another one I would recommend. Those are the top two for now. I could come up with so many more. Oh, another one that I'll end with is Arquay Harris. She's a director of engineering here at Slack, and she actually was the one who educated me a lot, not directly per se, but just educated me through her talks on self-advocacy and the importance of that. And she is a Black female, and also a director of engineering, which is, amazing. And I look up to her a lot because of that.
It's great to have role models, not just, at the entry level, but as you see them moving up, because many of them open doors for us as we join.
Exactly.
You joined a unicorn, right? This is a company. Slack is a unicorn, right? So can you tell us about your experience there and how, you've grown and where you hope to be?
Yeah, and I'd love to just add on to that. So I have this professional narrative that I created, and it goes kind of like this, I'm Frances, and I'm a unicorn that engineers solutions on behalf of another unicorn. And a lot of people get confused by that, but then I try to break it down for them. And you're completely right. Slack is a unicorn, which means that, according to the VC world, it's a startup valued at $1 billion or more. And it was coined that way because researchers found that the statistical likelihood of a tech startup becoming valued at $1 billion or more is only about 1%. And it just so happens that the Bureau of Labor reported in 2016 that only 1% of women in tech identify as Latina. So I am literally a unicorn working for another unicorn. Of course, I have no desire to remain in that situation, but it is what it is, and I'm hoping that will change because it should not be this like magical, rare event that I'm in this industry, in my opinion. But in terms of what we do at Slack, I can't say too much, obviously, for privacy reasons, but it's been great for me. I think they do really value D&I a lot more than most tech companies, and the numbers definitely show that. And there have been numerous articles and reports that show that Slack has been doing a lot better. And something that I'm particularly proud of is this article that I remember reading back in the day before I joined Slack about how, so like job descriptions, and sometimes job descriptions, if they're written a certain way, can attract a certain group of people. So what Slack did is that they analyzed their job descriptions through this third-party platform called Textio, and they found that a lot of these bigger tech companies were using phrases like wickedly, or winner takes all, or whatever it takes. And these were companies like Uber, Facebook, Amazon, and they were consistently appearing like these phrases, these negative phrases, I would say, in the job descriptions. And when you looked at Slack, phrases like meaningfully, like coming together, more of these kind of like collaborative phrases were mentioned far more often. And they found that through the results, some of these phrases would actually statistically appeal to men a lot more than women. And so something that I'm proud of is that even for like something that you would not really think about, as an engineer, like something as simple as a job description, you were taking that into account and we're trying to word it in a way that makes it inclusive and makes it so that we can appeal to all types of backgrounds. So that's something I'm very proud of working, as an employee of Slack.
Well, Adi Barreto from Textio was one of our guests. They share so much information and so much insight into how that technology is really changing the way some companies recruit. So it's kind of exciting to put two and two together since Adi was one of our previous guests.
Yes, I was with them on a panel for the Latinx and Tech Summit last year in Oakland. We were talking about intersectionality, so that's really great.
Thank you. Let me ask you, what's the best advice anyone has ever given you? And then immediately follow it with the worst advice that you hope no one else follows.
Okay, let me think. Oh, worst advice. I can start with worst advice because I just remember that off the top of my head. So worst advice I've ever gotten is work hard and things will work out for you, which is just not the case. I think a lot of people mistake Silicon Valley as this meritocracy. It's really not. It's not a level playing field. It should be, but that's just not the case right now. And it's going to take a lot more than hard work for you to get to the top or for you to get to the next level. This is something that I thought was the case a few years ago. Like, hey, if I just work my butt off, things are going to go great for me. No, it does matter like who you know beyond just like what you know. So that was the worst piece of advice I've gotten. And then I think the best piece of advice, I'll piggyback off what I said earlier, like being able to advocate for yourself, brand yourself, have a personal brand is a lot more important than a lot of engineers realize, or just people working in general in the tech industry, because no one's going to remember like what you did for this company if you've just been working there for a couple of years, but they will remember all the things that you publish, that you share, right? Like, for example, I could be doing all these things for my company, and outside of my company, I could be doing all these things like speaking, contributing to open source, yada, yada, being on a podcast like this. But if I don't market that, if I don't share that with my network, if I don't share that anywhere, no one's ever going to know about it, and none of that value will come back to me. you know? So you have to know how to market yourself, how to brand yourself in a way that will not just help who you're helping, but also help yourself.
And I think we come from a culture where we're used to being very humble,
Exactly.
humildes,
Yep.
humildes,
Yep.
and you have to get out of that in order to succeed in this, especially in this ecosystem. We have to be able to have a voice and also have others really understand what we bring to the table and everything that we do. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's true. And I completely relate to that humility aspect.
Well, let me ask, who has had the most influence on you and how has this shaped who you are today?
So this is a bit of a cliche, but I will say I think my mom has had a huge influence on me. She grew up in the country in Peru. She barely had electricity at any time. I don't think she had access to the internet until much later on than anyone here in the US would. And she really just did come from nothing and made herself like this wonderful life that she now has, like living in Virginia, which is where I'm from. And she's really happy. And basically, all that she's told me repeatedly, like, it's come through hard work. And it wasn't her that gave me that piece of advice earlier, like, do the work and, things will come to you. She doesn't believe that either. But she knows that she's had to do a lot of that hard work, just even that much, to come to where she is now. And one of the reasons that she inspires me, beyond all just that, is that she's willing to do what she's passionate about, even with and forsaking money, forsaking her happiness, just what she's passionate about. So she's currently a public school teacher teaching Spanish at Norview, which is this local high school in Norfolk, Virginia, which is again where I'm from. And she's been doing that for 20 plus years. And my dad is also an educator as well. So again, you can see, education has been this huge part of my life. And yeah, her high school kids love her. She always gets letters, notes, gifts, the smallest of things almost every week. She would get these, and I'm sure she still gets them now. I don't live with her anymore, of course, but seeing that love that she has for her field, I wanted to have that same love for my field. And I think I do right now. I could have a little more love. I could be more passionate about what I do. Because, when I see how passionate she is, it inspires me to try and be even more passionate about what I do. But even then, just seeing that growing up, I knew I wanted to get into something that it wasn't about the money. It was just about, am I passionate about it? If I'm not, I should just move on to something else. Right. So I would say my mom.
Your mom. Great. So what inspires you? What motivates you? What makes you the resilient person that you are, given that you are a unicorn in a unicorn?
Right. So I think I mentioned this before, but I have no desire, of course, to remain that, for the situation to remain that way. I'd like to instead, band together with other unicorns, other women of color like myself, so that we can in fact lead, influence, and inspire the next generation of women or people like us, and so that we too can bring value to this tech industry that is in fact inevitably going to dominate all of the world. It's going to be embedded in all of our lives, and the people right now who are controlling the algorithms, for the most part, that are embedded in all of our lives, it's a homogenous group of people. And I think many people recognize this, but especially within the fields of machine learning, artificial intelligence, we have to have a diverse group of people in those fields. We have to have Latinx represented in those fields, because if we don't have a diverse group of people, we're going to lead our systems to have even bigger biases against certain people. And we've already seen this in simpler examples. I clearly remember off the top of my head the Google Photos scandal, where they would classify people of color a certain way because they weren't testing for that, right? They probably didn't have many people of color on the team. So we have to have those voices in the room, and if we don't, we're going to end up in situations like I don't know if you remember the movie with the HAL 9000 from back in the day. It was a very old movie. I forgot the name of it. But there was this HAL 9000 robot that essentially wanted to take down humanity because no one had taught the robot how to act humane in the first place. So if we're not having diverse voices, essentially, we're not going to cater to diverse people. And if we don't cater to diverse people, they're going to be even more discriminated against than they are now, and we're going to have an even bigger divide in our society. It's just going to lead to more chaos. So I think in terms of the original question that you asked, why do I want to get into this? I want to make sure that people know that there are people who look like them, who come from similar backgrounds that are leading. And ergo, I want to lead by example so they themselves feel comfortable to not only enter into the tech industry, but also thrive. So I think that's a large part of the reason where my motivation comes from is wanting to lead by example so that other people can get to where I am and exceed me.
Thank you, Frances. How does someone get in contact with you or partner with you? What are some partnership opportunities? And I'm not going to let you go without you talking about your podcast, because I was reading your profile and I saw that you launched a podcast. So in the spirit of collaboration and helping other women of color move forward, can you also talk a little bit about what you're doing?
Yeah, sure. So if you wanted to connect with me, I use LinkedIn far more often than any other social media platform these days. I think it's because of the professional aspect, and I've never really liked the, less informal aspects of other networks like Facebook or Twitter. So LinkedIn is definitely the best place. You can just look up my name and you'll find me. In terms of collaborations, Tequila, if you are a part of a tech company who wanted to host a partner community event, we can make that happen for sure. Finally, for Tech Queens, right? So I did recently launch this new podcast called Tech Queens. I launched the first episode March 8th of this year for International Women's Day. And the reason I decided to launch this podcast, it turns out it's the first and only podcast that I know of so far as my research goes, that focuses on the stories and advice from women of color in tech. So the reason I decided to even launch in the first place, when I was listening to a lot of these tech podcasts, I enjoy listening to them, but I was starting to notice this disappointing trend where a lot of the hosts or the interviewees were mostly white men. And I wanted to find a podcast where I could hear people like me, so I looked for it. I first looked, couldn't find any. I found similar ones that focus on people of color in tech, but not specifically women of color in tech. And I took a few months, did some more research, kind of doubted myself a little bit, should I be the one to start this? But, went ahead and decided to do it anyways. And so it has finally launched, and I'm hoping to have the second episode released April 15th. But I've recorded so far 5 sessions with a plan to publish a session every month or twice every month, depending on my bandwidth. So that's where it is now. And, if you identify as a woman of color, or if you know a woman of color, feel free to go to the website, techqueenspod.com, or just look up Tech Queens Podcast. You'll find it. And you can just fill out the form, and I'll get back to you.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing so much. I hope everyone that's listening can also listen to your podcast. And I look forward to collaborating with you in the future. Thanks for joining us today. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook at Latinx America and on Twitter at America Latinx, or email any questions or ideas to latinxamerica@gmail.com. Gracias y hasta la próxima semana.